Okay, are we all set? Can you hear us? Is our audio okay? Okay, should we start? I, of course, had to tweet that photo because look at this crowd. Thank you all for being here to listen to Shashi Tharoor on his new book and collection of essays, India Shastra, and Mihir Sharma with Restart. To start with, of course, I want to congratulate both of you on this and releasing your book here. I don't think Shashi Tharoor needs much of an introduction at all. And what we're going to do in this, not as Mihir for that matter, we have two of these leading, and reading both of their books, it strikes me that, you know, they're both extremely erudite, very clear worldviews, and of course a confidence to articulate them, but they're also extremely accessible. Because both of the books have just come out, I'm going to ask them to read a small passage to set up what we're going to be talking about over the next hour. And we will take some questions at the end about the books and what we've been talking about. So Mihir, do you want to go first with the section that you've picked out?
Yes, so Amrita asked me basically to start by trying to read something that broadly is about the book and what I'm trying to talk about in it. So by the time that Modi was sworn in as Prime Minister in May 2014, India's mood had completely altered again. The long years of hesitation and populism, it seemed, had passed. There was a government that had a mandate to take brave decisions. Things could change, which was good because things had to change. This book is a story of what has to change. Book is a story of what has already changed in the Indian economy, what needs to change, and this book is about why change is inevitable. India is broken, but it is going to be mended. It is going to be mended not because any one man wants it, but because 1 billion people need it. It is going to be mended because every assumption about its economy is being questioned and every myth is being seen through. It is going to be mended not just because India is special, but also because it is not. Every emerging market has similar problems, and every one of those countries is working to fix them. Those same problems have already been fixed before by many other countries on their roads to prosperity. This book is about those problems, the problems of infrastructure, of populism, of corruption, and about how they are not just problems, but actually a necessity, an essential part of any economy's road to maturity. No modern economy can be built without dealing with these problems. How will people be moved off the land and into factories? How will the poor educate themselves and feed themselves and be given the chance to become middle class? How will roads and bridges and ports be built? Industrial nations have already addressed these problems. But it is only when these problems are being struggled with that you know that a country is progressing and not stagnating. And each one of them is about millions of lives and about 1 billion tiny decisions, and also about the 2 or 3 big decisions that will matter most. What's different about today's developing nations is that most of them are doing this as democracies. They have to deal with dissent and disagreement and also democratic vetoes of one kind or another, especially in India. India is the most complex country in the world. It has the most layered democracy, the most varied interest groups, and the largest numbers of vetoes. That means that there is a lot of noise. The policy machinery is not well oiled. But the noise that it is making is not that of a crash. It is a noise that accompanies building. And this book is about that noise, and it is about what we are building.
Which is quite a lot to pack in. What's fabulous is it doesn't just stop at the system is broken. You go on to list out very clearly what needs to be done. And there's a range of issues in there, including the legal infrastructure, you know, politics choking Maharashtra's growth. We're going to come to that in a moment. Shashi, you were reading this as well earlier, and Mihir has really done a fabulous job. Will you read us a little bit from your introduction about your book?
Sure. And I want to say Mihir's book is delightful, so he's just given you a taste of it. Mine, in a sense, completes a sort of trilogy of books about India that I've written over the years. India from Midnight to the Millennium, at the time of the 50th anniversary of India's independence, The Elephant, the Tiger, and the Cell Phone at the time of the 60th anniversary, both of which tried to cover the broad sweep of politics, history, culture, society in our country. And India Shastra takes up my interest, the things that have occupied my mind and my writings, in 99 short, sometimes not so short, essays on various themes. So as I say, as you said from the introduction, my basic thesis about India has remained consistent in these 3 books. It is a land of extraordinary pluralism and diversity, where political democracy is indispensable to national survival, a country of great economic potential, held back by some of its own policies and practices, many of which are in the process of being re-examined and reinvented, and a lively, contentious, and exciting society which is far removed from the timeless and unchanging land of well-worn cliché. A Rip Kumar Winkle who had fallen asleep at the end of the Second World War 70 years ago would be unable to recognize the India of 2015. Everything has either changed dramatically or is in the process of changing. The nation's politics, its economic preferences, its social assumptions, the relations amongst castes, the material and professional choices available in the country, the patterns and habits of daily life, and the intangible attitudes of Indians towards everything from religion to profit-making. I am, I suppose, an old-fashioned liberal, one who believes in political liberty, social freedoms, minimal restrictions on economic activity, and a concern for social justice. This has tended to put me in a very small minority in India, where political opinion is divided between a left pledged to upholding socialism and state command of the economy, and a right defined principally by its adherence to religious and cultural nationalism rather than economic or political convictions. The one liberal political party that largely embodied my views, Rajagopalachari's Swatantra Party, disappeared in 1974. And it was only after the liberalization policies undertaken by the Congress in 1991 that I was able to find a congenial home there, albeit on some issues on its fringes. My political isolation in many respects has been compounded by the robustness of my views on foreign policy and national security, laid out in greatest detail in Pax Indica, India and the World of the 21st Century. A liberal hawk is a rare bird anywhere, but particularly in India, whose social and economic pieties and peace-loving credentials were sanctified by the hallowed freedom movement led by Mahatma Gandhi. And yet, as this book suggests, India may be coming increasingly around to the point where my beliefs might one day even appear mainstream. Prime Minister Modi's speeches and sound bites since his election could certainly have been scripted by a liberal, though the gap between articulation and implementation, in his case, remains currently wide enough to drive a rut through. What can one make of a man who speaks of tolerance and accommodation while condoning hate speech by party members he has appointed as ministers? How does one interpret a PM who speaks of minimal government, maximum governance, but is in the process of running the most centralized, top-down, bureaucracy-driven, personality cult-dominated central government since Indira Gandhi's emergency rule? What conclusion can one reasonably derive about a leader who says the government has no business to be in business, but has never said a word to question the anomaly of his government owning and running airlines and hotels? How can one interpret the intentions of a prime minister elected on a promise of delivering results, whose very fine speeches and liberal pronouncements appear completely disconnected from any tangible action plan, adequate funding, or execution capacity? So the jury is still out on how much we can celebrate the Modification of India. Then I talk about the prospects for the expansion of liberal space in India over a few pages, which I will not summarize for you. But then I end with this. As a political representative in India today, I certainly do not take the prospects of success for granted. The process of doing what I've described is not just huge in itself. It also involves something no society, not even China, has yet attempted. And that is to connect millions of citizens in a functioning democracy to their own government, not just to announce entitlements that they're expected to grasp for themselves, but to create delivery mechanisms that ensure that these entitlements are not just theoretical, but real and accessible. Prime Minister Modi seems to understand this if his speeches are anything to go by. But in India, the right diagnosis does not always result in the right prescription. And even when it does, there is no guarantee that it will cure the condition. Implementation of good ideas has long been our national weakness. If Modi can change this familiar narrative, he will have earned his place in history. So far, we in the opposition have not seen enough to dispel our skepticism, though it is reasonable to argue that 6 months is far too short a time to draw emphatic conclusions either way. But there is a paradox at the heart of Modi's ascent to the prime ministership. His speeches and rhetoric appear to recognize and harness a vital shift in our national politics from a politics of identity to a politics of performance. Yet he has ridden to power at the helm of a party, the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is ill-suited to the challenge of delinking India's polity from the incendiary issue of religious identity that it had built its base on. And his rise to office has empowered the khaki shorts-wearing cultural organization, within quotes, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, whose views on every subject, economics, politics, history, culture, morality, gender relations, even matters of appropriate dress or conduct, are totally illiberal. Mr. Modi has built his appeal by putting the focus on what India's people manifestly need: more development, better governance, wider socioeconomic opportunities. But having won an election by attracting voters to these themes, he has given free rein to the most retrograde elements in Indian society, who are busy rewriting textbooks, extolling the virtues of ancient science over modern technology, advocating protectionism and self-reliance against free trade and foreign investment, and asserting that India's identity must be purely Hindu. Mr. Modi cannot be oblivious to this fundamental contradiction, but he can only resolve it by jettisoning the very forces that have helped ensure his electoral victory. I'm not sure whether such a fundamental contradiction can even be resolved, and in that may lie the seeds of Modi's future failure. I go on, of course, there are other essays in the book on everything from whether you can wear dhotis in India's fashionable clubs to the Mars mission, to educational policies. There's 99 different themes in the book, but I hope that you will find some of these summarized in the broad thrust of the introduction I've been reading out from.
And also fascinatingly, you end with this sort of ode to aging and what it means. We're going to come to that as well. But you know, Mihir, I do want to ask you, because I do note that both of you, as you're looking at where we stand right now, and frankly, if I'd known when I was a TV anchor that policy paralysis was not the right phrase, we wouldn't have used it to death. But do you want to talk about, taking from what Shashi's been reading, the challenges right now? I mean, Modi has had this honeymoon period. I think it was Swami Iyer who said that, you know, the next budget will be really when we see whether that's over, what are they going to really be coming up with? Because you're also looking forward to what the government actually has to achieve now.
Well, I think that the important thing to realize is that when Modi ran his election campaign, he talked about a lot of things, and we got a clear sense that he intended to transform India in some way. What he didn't talk about, and you know, that's our fault as well, because you know, you and I, we were journalists, we are journalists, and our profession didn't perhaps ask him the right questions. And we still don't know exactly what he thinks, how he thinks he's going to do it. All right, we don't know what laws he intends to change. We all know what the problems are. We don't have the roads, and we know that in Gujarat he built the roads. We know that we have problems with land acquisition, and we believe that Gujarat may have fixed these problems. He's never actually stepped up and explained how this is going to work at the national level. Not once. All right, we don't have a template for what this government intends to do. What form of reform will it actually usher in? And that is why I think the budget is so crucially important. Across the world, India is one of the few bright sparks in the world economy. All right, we may, hopefully over the next couple of years, as China slows down, we may become the fastest growing large country in the world. However, that will not be enough, because people will still be looking to us and saying, what is it precisely that we want to do with our future? Do we have a game plan? And if the Modi government does not present one at the budget, all right, a lot of very, very tough questions will begin to be asked.
hopefully, certainly by the press. And also this is something you say, because you say that, it would be churlish as a member of the opposition not to note the positives, but so far we're hearing all the speeches, we're not actually seeing all the concrete, and both of you would agree, it's not just that throwing money at things solves anything. You have to have, as Mihir says, a game plan, and you're also saying that the last budget sort of left you underwhelmed.
Well, yes, I have a chapter on the last budget, and you can see why it left me underwhelmed. I mean, the only worthwhile things in it were things the UPA had already done, or at least started, and they simply changed the name. So instead of a game-changing budget, we had a name-changing budget. But beyond that, there wasn't a whole lot.
Yeah. But you do say it was too soon, maybe perhaps to judge
yes,
that.
yes, it is soon. And so as Mihir says, let's wait for next month when on a Saturday, which is very unusual, they've convened Parliament on a Saturday to hear the budget on the 28th of February. And it'll be interesting to see what they come up with, because my worry has always been that we hear these speeches, but there's no actual mechanism to implement what comes out of these speeches.
Is there one key thing or two key things that you're looking for? Because I know Mihir has some specifics that he wants them to
There's so much that can be done. And in fact, in the economic side, Mihir's book lays out a number of very, very sensible analyses. He does so very wittily. There's a chapter that I commend to all of you where he summarizes the number of rules that the government inspector has the right to inspect. And at one point there is a footnote, and you go to the footnote expecting to find some learned academic journal article adduced to support his thesis. And the entire footnote says, I want to stress I'm not making any of this up, which I think is absolutely priceless. And this is the problem. There's just so many low-hanging fruit that a true reformer can get rid of very quickly. But we've seen no signs of that. I mean, they haven't passed any ordinances that actually tackle half the problems that Mihir has done. In fact, many of their ordinances have been politically self-serving rather than actually getting to the fundamental issues. So I do worry whether we have the vision without the implementation and without any serious effort to even understand what is required for implementation.
So that's what we're waiting to see. And I mean, Shashi has a couple of columns on this as well. For example, and you talk about this, when it was time to say, take some of those tough decisions, given that it's not a coalition government anymore, you have that sort of majority, they've sort of, you've been a little waffly on, fuel price hike, on the subsidies, and you talk about what really what you need now is clarity and again, a game plan.
Well, I think the really interesting thing is that I think Narendra Modi is, first of all, he is the most popular leader in world history ever in terms of the number of people who have voted for him. All right.
And Hugh Jackman, don't forget Hugh Jackman. Madison Square Garden.
So he carries with him a certain amount of, I mean, whether we like it or not, moral authority almost. And he has more political capital to spend than anybody else in our history, except maybe for Rajiv Gandhi in 1984. Now, the essential point is, what is he going to do with that? And this is the moment, I think, that a lot of us were expecting that the unfinished agenda of 1991 would be tackled. The 1991 reforms we were forced into them. We were bankrupt. And we did a little bit, and we got out of our immediate problems. And then we said, okay, now we'll sit back and we'll run for 2 decades on the stuff that was done between 1991 and 1994. We are, in fact, coming to the end of the impetus that those reforms provided us. And what Mr. Modi can actually do, and he seems to be gesturing in this direction, is he can build up an actual political consensus for the reform process. All right? He has the most powerful the largest bully pulpit in human history. He can go out and say these are things that need to be done. However, what is really odd is that even in economics, for example, the party president of the BJP, who is in charge of politics, is the one who is going around saying that, for example, yes, we don't want to raise fuel prices ever. All right, he is, for example, also saying that don't ask us about reform. He actually said this in an interview. Reform is a Western word. We in the BJP don't believe in such Western concepts. All right, so the question really is, at what point is Modi going to step up and say, look, I am going to now sell these individual kinds of reform to the people who have voted for me because I am that kind of leader. And that, in fact, I think is the kind of strong leadership that probably he was elected for.
Sure, and that's something we're waiting to see. We're going to take this a little bit forward as well, because one of the other insights you have is we keep talking about India's demographic dividend. Mihir has another take on what the what the impact is on India. Do you want to read that one paragraph? Basically,
yeah.
explaining how it's what makes us also impatient, and this quick
Okay,
turnaround.
go today to a small Indian town. There are only 3 places where you see vibrant activity: queues, discussion, energy. One is the alcohol shop. The second is the news agent. Why? Because he also sells application forms for public sector jobs. And the third is the guy who sells lottery tickets. This tells its own story, the story of desperation and of hope. And it also raises 3 questions. First, where did all these young people come from? Second, why do they have nowhere to go? And third, why aren't they making something of themselves? Here is the very, very short answer to each question. First, many of them, perhaps almost all of them, came from farms, and they really do not want to go back. Indian agriculture is a dead end until something changes. Second, in other countries and in other times, they would have gone and would have been soaked up by a vibrant manufacturing sector, by factories. India has not got one unless something changes. And third, they do not have the skills for white-collar jobs or even for the few blue-collar jobs that are available. And something there will have to change.
And you both, this is something that I find resonance in your book as well, because you're saying the success of the next arguably decade or so is going to be based on these 13 million young Indians every year who need employment. Where's the plan? How is the government going to go about that?
Yeah, I actually agree with Mihir, which of course leads to a much less exciting panel, because pretty much everything I've read in his book, which I haven't yet finished, is stuff that I've believed and said for somewhat longer than the poor man has, but he says it better and more wittily. I'll just say that when I was minister in the Human Resource Development Ministry, my argument was that we have to understand education not just as an economic challenge, but actually as a national security issue. Because if we don't, you see, basically we've got this massive demographic advantage in theory. There is this huge population. 50.1% is under 25, which is a world record. On top of that, you've got 225 million people between 10 and 19, the ones who are about to get their education or finish their education, get into the workforce. The ILO has already done studies saying that we will have by 2020 116 million people starting work, that is between 20 and 25, and the Chinese will be down to 93 million. We will actually have 20% more workers than they will have. Now, all of this can be a tremendous advantage. We could become the sort of engine of the world that Mr. Modi describes in his speeches. But that can only happen if we can equip these young people with the training or the education, blue collar, white collar, whatever, to actually take advantage of the opportunities that this huge demographic advantage gives us. But if we fail to do that, if we don't actually get down and create a massive capacity for training and equipping these people, the alternative stares us very starkly in the face. And that is what we're seeing with the Maoists and the Naxalites, because you've basically got legions of unemployed because uneducated or undereducated and unemployable young men who have essentially absolutely nothing better to do, no stake in our society, no hope of advancement within our economy, and therefore are prey to the blandishment of evil men with a gun and 1,000 rupees, which is what basically we've got in 165 of our 625 districts. So this is a national security challenge as well. It's not just a question of whether you have a 4-year college degree or a 3-year degree, or whether the RSS writes the textbooks or Irfan Habib writes a textbook. I mean, for God's sake, we have fundamental issues. I wanted, for example, to challenge our private sector to get into vocational training rather than leaving it just to the government. I don't understand why they don't do it. In a country of 1.2 billion people, we have a nationwide shortage of certified masons. We don't have a nationwide shortage of certified plumbers. Why? Our country needs this. You can't build a building without people to install your toilets properly, put in connections, electricity, whatever. Now, essentially, these are things we could easily be doing. Mihir gives other examples across the board. We do need to revive our factories. Mr. Modi says that. But where's he going to get the people from to do it? Even for our regulatory system, we don't have enough people who are equipped to actually conduct the kinds of work that our regulators are supposed to conduct across the board. The government, we all think of the government as this behemoth because you go to any government office and there are 20 peons hanging around the corridor chatting to each other. But in fact, for the actual cutting edge of work, our government is deeply, deeply inadequate in terms of size for the kinds of work it needs to do. Our foreign ministry is one of the smallest foreign ministries in the world for one of the biggest countries, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot that we can do now. People like me and many others have diagnosed all of this for years. There's no problem with the diagnosis. It's actually prescribing the right solutions and finding the political will to implement them. Now, people like Mihir and I in our writings are trying to find the solutions. But will those at the top who have won this massive mandate that Mihir has described, will they first of all buy into these solutions and then take the steps, which means courageous political actions, it means losing some of the political base you've been taking for granted, it means disappointing some vested interests, it means opening up some spaces. Remember, for every dysfunctional or negative thing in our country, somebody has learned how to profit from it. Somebody has learned how to do well with it, manipulate it, implement it, and they're going to turn against you once you break it down. So you have to have political courage. And I'm sorry to say, 6 months certainly, we have not seen that yet from a government which, as Mihir says, has a phenomenal mandate.
But then to flip that, Shashi, because people will, of course, ask the question as well. The previous government, and you said this, that many of these issues, magically didn't appear overnight. There's been, not enough progress done by the previous government either. And that's something that you talk about as well. What are your comments when people ask you about that?
No, it's true. I mean, I've written about this, for God's sake. I mean, the fact is, in 1991, we took 40 years of accumulated problems by the scruff of the neck and started dismantling a number of things. But there were political limitations because Narasimha Rao really didn't have a majority. He was sort of buying the Jharkhand Mukti Morcha support to just survive votes of confidence. And he sort of got a lot of reforms in, but paid a huge political price and lost the election as well. I mean, had he been re-elected, who knows how far reform might have gone. But he was already running out of political courage to pursue reforms during the latter half of his one term. And we had a second wave of a bold, innovative economic policy making in UPA 1 under Manmohan Singh and Montek Singh Ahluwalia. And then things began to slow down a bit, partly because of the politics and partly for other reasons that many others can analyze better than me. But now you have what Mihir in his book subtitle calls the last chance. Because you've really hit pretty much rock bottom and you've got to pull up, because it's not as bad as 91 when we were even mortgaging our gold in London to meet our current account deficit. It's not as bad as that, but given the potential we represent, this is our last chance to convince those who believed in our potential that we are capable of fulfilling that potential. Because there were a lot of people who said, we were the next big thing. Read books that were published in the last 10 years. Even my book, The Elephant, the Tiger, and the Cell Phone in 2007, the American publishers threw in a subtitle saying, India, the next superpower. This was the kind of thinking everyone had in the Western world about us. And obviously, we have disappointed them and we've disappointed ourselves. Now, if we don't get it right this time, believe me, they're not coming back. There's a little crack by Mihir about, which is actually an old joke, but many of you may not have heard it. When BRIC came up as an investment concept, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, as the next growth economies, and of course, we didn't match what the expectations of the investment backers were. Some of the cynics started saying BRIC really stands for bloody ridiculous investment concept. And we have to change that mentality as far as it applies to us.
Actually, what I was going to ask you, because that's what you start by saying. The person who coined the term BRICS was so disappointed with India's growth. And you do talk about the irony of, Manmohan Singh, who's, heralded as being the architect of our reforms process, also overseeing the decline. But you said the slowdown is actually just a symptom.
Well, I think that, it wasn't, it was a symptom of an underlying and deeper problem, all right? What we saw between 2010 and 2014 and last year was that a lot of power plants that we expected would get built did not get built. A lot of factories that we expected would get built did not get built. Roads did not get built. That just saw all our investment, suddenly collapse. That saw our growth suddenly collapse. Why did this not get built? Now, the simple answer is because someone in Delhi wasn't signing a form. But that's not really truthful, because this is what actually stopped happening was that we ran into the capacity constraints of the government at every point down the line. Okay, you need, in order to build anything, build a large infrastructure project, you need clearances from the state level, from 17 different ministries, you need clearances at a central level, and these are not bad things to actually have to go through. Not all of them, right? You need to make sure that that environmental degradation doesn't go too far. You need to make sure that everybody whose land you're taking has been paid. These are things that you need to do. However, the government that had set up the laws that said you had to do that just did not have the capacity to implement those laws at the scale in which it intended to implement them in UPA 1. All right? That was what went wrong. Now, suddenly you were sitting in 2010, and it's like, I was so ambitious in 2005 when I said that I would have power for everyone within 10 years. And I said I would build all these power plants, but now I have two options. Either I don't build these power plants, or I cut through all my environmental regulations. And that was the situation that we actually found ourselves in, and that was the policy paralysis that we were confronted with. Now, the question is that now, sitting in 2015, what do we do about this? Do we actually give up on power plants, or do we say we need to fix our environmental laws? The really odd thing here is that one fears that the government would just say, okay, I want to gut all form of environmental regulation. That is not the right answer, because that will lead to its own problems. It will upset and anger enough people that there will be problems, that there will be national security problems. And also, you know, we need to live in a country that retains at least some of its environment. So if you gut all the laws, then you are in trouble. We actually need to expand the government in precisely the way that Shashi is suggesting, in such a way that we can implement our laws properly.
And it's great, because you also say that you've been saying for the longest time that the Foreign Service, for example, should be recruiting mid-sector employees from the private world as well. Let's just get a show of hands of questions, because we'd love to. And also, let's get the mic out. I think we should send a copy of both books to the Prime Minister's office. You both have done a great job of laying out your game plan. Mics, who's got the mics? And again, as you say, diagnosing is half the problem. Now you have to implement the solutions.
I recently read Alvin Toffler's The Third Wave, and taking a leaf out of the ideas he presented in that book, I noticed that our country has the largest agriculture-based population, which is ruled by the largest industry-oriented government and the largest young third wave population. So don't you think that's a problem, and how do you suggest we remedy that to, you know, help us move forward? Thank you.
Can't give you a short answer, young man, because obviously that's what the books are both about. And I will say that, that there are these contradictions. In fact, we are a land of paradoxes, famously. And the truth is that you mentioned the world's youngest population. We also hold the world record, which Mr. Modi's government has not much improved upon, for the largest gap between the average age of the population and the average age of the cabinet. You know, his is slightly better than UPA's was, but the fact is that, yeah, we are a young country ruled by older people. And we need to actually, it seems to me, just free our young people to get more things done. At the same time, it's also true that unless the opportunities exist, unless you've had the chance to learn the things that'll help you to start your own business, join another business, get a job in the manufacturing industry, do something productive with your time, you will waste a lot of your time in being a fixer or a gopher or an assistant or a tea drinker, a lot of which is what disguises the waste of time that many of our young people are enduring today. The challenge is great. What we need to do is actually implement what everyone at the top is saying they want to do.
All right, there's a question here.
Sir, we surely have problems to overcome, but what, according to you today, still contributes to the soft power of our country after the cell phones?
Well, the soft power argument, which I'm quite proud of having injected into our discourse and which is often repeated now ad nauseum, and to a point where I'm tired of repeating it myself, is that it's that the attraction of our culture is one of our biggest strengths. That when people think of India in the world, they think of a number of qualities that have nothing to do with our economics or our military or our domestic issues, really. They think of Bollywood movies and music and yoga and Ayurveda and alternative ways of experiencing reality and wellness and spirituality and all of that. And all of this combines right up to and including Indian fashion and Indian cuisine and Indian restaurants around the world into giving people a favorable disposition towards India. You see, and that is something which we can capitalize on. We can actually use this to our advantage in winning more foreign interest, more foreign support, more foreign investment. But it's not, to my mind, an end in itself, because ultimately, my line is that today, it's not the country with the bigger army that wins, it's a country with the bigger, better story that wins. But the better story must be a real story. You know, we have all these wonderful tourism posters saying incredible India. But if the story behind that facade is not real, then you won't have a credible India, and we need to have both.
Great. Can we get some questions for Mihir as well? Let's balance them out.
This is for Mr. Shashi Tharoor. Sir, just some context before the question, sir. We were promised democracy and development. What we got instead was totalitarianism and the trident agenda, sir. Ghar Wapsi, Love Jihad, Bahu Lao, Beti Bachao, sir. These can be seen. VHP is, with its full force advancing with its agenda. Sir, do you not think, for example, when Advani was doing these sort of things, Atal Bihari was condoning these things. When Modi was doing it, Advani was condoning it. Now, Sakshi Maharaj is doing it, Niranjan Jyoti is doing it, and Modi is playing the role that they played, sir. So, sir, what are your thoughts, sir? 5 years down the line, do you think this affects our secular fabric, sir?
So this is the fundamental contradiction I summarized in the paragraph I read from the introduction. And I genuinely believe that Mr. Modi has to grasp this nettle or he will fail. I'll give you one simple example of this. You're talking about foreign investment. You want to convey a positive image of your country and your government and your policies to foreign investors so they'll come in and produce, therefore, the things that perhaps India yet doesn't have the capacity to produce, generate jobs, put money into our economy, and so on. Now, I'm getting emails, I've quoted one in an article I wrote after this book went to press, from a European investor saying, what are we reading in our German papers about burning of churches and Ghar Wapasi and India being a Hindu nation? Why should I, as a Christian German, want to bring my money? He was contemplating a $250 million investment. Why should I bring it into India? And he said, will Arab investors come into a country if Muslims are not feeling secure? Now, Mr. Modi had better realize this, because he does have a lot of people who get his party to win elections, who simply don't understand the logic of his economics, and who don't really care. In fact, they will actually resent foreigners coming in. They don't believe in foreign investment. They don't care what foreigners think of them. It's all about this nativist, atavistic cultural agenda. And it seems to me that unless he clamps down very hard, reads them the Riot Act at all levels, shows his disapproval when they say these things, rather than his silence, which is what we've seen so far. Unless he does this, believe me, his economic agenda, and therefore the promises he's made to the young voters of jobs and growth, cannot be fulfilled. And if they cannot be fulfilled, well, the Congress will be waiting in the next election, believe me, to get even.
Hello, Mihir sir. A question for you. So what is the point on the youth of the country? We all have heard about what the government is doing. Is it doing right or wrong? Totally agreed or not agreed. But the point is that where the youth of the country is lying, and what is the option in the front of the youth today? That's it, sir.
Well, I think that, first of all, I have to recognize that things have changed a lot since I was younger. I think that when I was maybe your age, in my early 20s, nobody I knew would have even imagined going into business for themselves. Now, I think that if I were asked for a show of hands here, I'm sure a lot more people would be willing to say that they would go into business for themselves than would have been the case 10 years ago. Genuinely, I think that there is a great deal of frustration for young people at various different classes of India about the struggles that they have to go through in order to achieve what they intend to achieve. And we who sort of sit and talk about policy sometimes don't quite understand that when people want a job, they want something simple. They're not just asking for a one-year job, they're asking for security. All right? They want to be able to tell their mother that they have settled down, okay, which I still have not been able to tell my mother, all right, because I'm in journalism and that's a sunset profession. So you want that kind of security, and a government can no longer provide that kind of job security in the way that it could have done 50 years ago. The only thing that can do that is such a vibrant economy that you know I will be able to find a job. The only thing that can do that is a kind of skilling system that says that, okay, I'm a smart person, I should be able to pick up the skills that I will need, I should be able to retrain myself at the time that I need to retrain myself. Now, if there's one thing that's what young people need, that I think that's what young people want, and my expectation is that if young people focus on demanding that at every level that they can, given their actual sheer numbers in this country, the government will have to provide it.
We're getting another question. We have a question in the back first.
Good afternoon, Mihir. Good afternoon, Shashi. We've been talking about this since, so my question is a little bit of context before I ask my question. We've seen that around 60% of the population in our country is employed in agriculture, and which in itself reflects a lot of disguised unemployment. That is why we've been listening to both of you that we need people to move into manufacturing sector. But when we talk about that, one very important thing is that people have to be given some amount of skill so that they be absorbed inside the manufacturing sector. Now, education is one thing it's a kind of investment whose return will come after a certain amount of time, not immediately. But functional education or skill development is one thing which is very important, because that is a necessary element of anybody to be absorbed into manufacturing sector. Now, I'd like Mr. Shashi Tharoor to reflect upon this. That how do you think we should focus more upon this functional education and skill development?
Well, I've got a lengthy essay on this in the book, which I hope you will read. But fundamentally, there's absolutely no getting away from this. We need to do this. And because of the time problem, because indeed a lot of this is a long-term investment, some of the investment we have made in UPA, from the Right to Education Act onwards, and the increasing amounts of money every year until the final budget, money has gone, investment has gone, and results are too early to see, but the expansion of the education space has begun to take place. Where we need, it seems to me, to also redouble our efforts, and we'd only just begun to do that when we lost the election, is in the vocational training skill development area. My government came up, for example, with this Western concept of community colleges, where you would have something for kids who didn't do well enough at high school to really go to college, but who are trainable to acquire skills and certifiable qualifications that will help them to be employed in industry. And while they're in a community college, it'll be a 2-year course, they can also do some academic work, and if they're just simply messed up their examinations and do have some academic talent, they can take their 2-year certificate and go back to a university. Now, this concept that UPA got through in the last year has run into various implementation problems. We'd actually announced and found money for 100 community colleges in 1 year. I'd like to see the BJP do that or something like it to try and absorb these people who are not going to come out and get white-collar jobs. You know, something like 78% of those who get engineering degrees in this country do not end up doing jobs that require an engineering degree. So we actually need to reduce the mismatch between the kind of qualifications you get in higher education and what our economy needs. UPA now said you can't open a new polytechnic in India unless you actually have a tie-up to an actually functioning industry within 30 kilometers of the polytechnic. Why? Because there's no point, somebody sitting and teaching you from a textbook some industrial processes he learned 30 years ago when he was a student, and which have no application, no bearing to any real conditions in real industries that are functioning today. So we need now to start connecting much more. I was a huge advocate of what we call the industry-academia interface. Get industry in at all levels. So in the polytechnics, the vocational thing, get them in actually training kids doing things with their own hands. Keep the faculty obliged to go in and refresh themselves every summer holiday. At higher education, why can't our companies come in and pay universities to research for them? We don't do this. Very common in the West. If you look at the OECD countries, the Western countries, 75% of overall expenditure on research is actually done by the private sector. In India, it's 15%. We depend on the government on everything. Government is spending 80%. So everybody only does research if the Department of Science and Technology, after various bureaucratic procedures, comes and gives you a grant. No, we've got to get away from that. We've got to loosen up, and I would also challenge our private sector to stand up, get involved, and it's their country too, it's their future as well. And all of this needs to be done. The answer that I've given you now just skims the surface. There's very much more in the book.
In his book, and also Mihir, you have a
Yeah, Mihir
chapter
was
on wrong jobs, wrong skills.
Well, I mean, there's just one bit I wanted to say that construction is not the most skilled job anywhere in the world. In India, it's often the sector that those displaced from the agricultural sector try first. But only one of every 10 Indian workers in construction is considered skilled by her employer. Indian builders, and this is true, frequently bring in construction workers from China or the Philippines to complete projects because they are more productive. By one estimate, we'll need over 7 million skilled construction workers by 2022. However, here again you have a problem of capacity because the training institutes for construction workers, for example, you need to have passed the class 10 board examination and you need to have had science as one of your subjects. You don't want anybody studying arts to work on a construction site. I mean, this is ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's like the courses are 3 years long. Most construction workers are migrants. You expect them to spend 3 full years learning this basic skills and they need to become skilled workers on a construction site? I mean, so the other fascinating and terrifying thing is that of all the 8,000 industrial training institutes that we have in this country, not one of them has a placement officer, a full-time placement officer.
So copies of these books to be sent out to more people. I'm making a list for both of you.
To
Go
Mihir,
ahead.
one simple thing that is he not waiting for the change of scene in Rajya Sabha to bring in some more changes or rules or whatever he's trying to come up with? And number two, what do you have to say to the basic straight problem of Clean India campaign? I would think he has got Indians to at least pay some attention, and what is your reaction on that? Because that is one thing which is glaring in our eyes.
Sure.
And that's
Good
all.
question. Actually, we did want to ask you this as well because, of course, it caused a bit of a flutter. Your reaction, it's quite well set
Sure.
out.
Look, on the Rajya Sabha thing, it actually highlights the contradiction I pointed out. Because he can only change the composition of the Rajya Sabha by winning more state elections. And he needs these stormtroopers of the RSS and the VHP and the Hindutva Brigade to win in those elections, which then undercuts the very purpose of getting him a majority because he won't be able to implement the policies on which he's won the Lok Sabha election. It's a fundamental contradiction and he has to make a choice. On the question of the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan or the Clean India campaign, I actually thought, and I've said so at some length, and it's in the book as well, I've got a whole essay on the Swachh Bharat campaign in India Shastra, that the campaign was unexceptionable, but he was the first prime minister to use the bully pulpit, to use the visibility of his office to bring the nation's attention to it. But this only works if you can actually sustain it. If Clean India becomes a photo op every October 2nd for a number of grandees to pick up a broom, who will never pick up another jhadu in their lives till the next October 2nd, then I'm afraid you're not going to see a transformation. Where is the budget to change anything? Who is tasked with implementation? Where have you seen any significant visible difference in any of the areas in our country or your city or your neighborhood that you know to be perennially dirty? You know, there is actually more effective work being done by NGOs that have actually set examples in small localities. I don't know if you can YouTube the Ugly Indian campaign. They've done great work. I'm trying to do something similar in my constituency. But when I participated in a cleanup in my beach area, I said there's no point just cleaning up this particular beach. I have to supply a biogas plant, so some of the garbage they're dumping on the beach, they'll now take to the biogas plant instead. Because our infrastructure is bad. Municipal waste disposal is a colossal failure in my constituency and many other parts of the country. People aren't picking up garbage because they have no place to take it to. People aren't dumping garbage because no one's picking it up. No one's picking it up because they have no place to take it to. No place to take it to doesn't get processed and dispersed. And the result is garbage piles up on the streets and becomes an eyesore. So Mr. Modi has touched something which everyone in middle class India thinks is a great idea. But as I keep saying in this book, how is he going to implement it? Where is the long-term follow-up? I gave him a particular proposal from my constituency where I said, you know, since the government is attaching so much importance to cleaning, here is a particular problem. We have canals in Thiruvananthapuram. Used to be a vital mode of transportation, of drinking water, everything. And now what's happened is they're completely choked up. They're basically sewage. Now, if you want to clean up a particular canal system, what you need to do is not just clean it, flush it out once and empty the garbage once. You have to create sewage lines so the people whose sewage is getting into the canals, it will not go in anymore. Secondly, you need to actually improve water supplies to the people on both sides. You need to create facilities. It's a major infrastructure project. If the central government actually had a budget to do this, then you would really get a shining example of Swachh Bharat. I haven't had a reply yet. And I'm just saying, ultimately, if we can't get beyond the slogans, if we can't get beyond the photo ops, I'm afraid the hollowness of the ambition will sadly create more desperation, more disappointment, and more frustration. Because you articulated the ambition, you've put that great vision out there, but you haven't taken the trouble to do all the steps in between to actually get it done. That's my biggest problem with this government.
And you have those awkward photo ops where they're planting the garbage to be swept, and those are coming out as well. You had a few points as well.
Well, I think that you're absolutely right that to a certain extent he may be worried about the Rajya Sabha. But the truth is that when the Rajya Sabha is sorted out, there may be something else subsequently to worry about. There's, in politics and in government, as far as I can see from the outside, there's always a reason that you can find to postpone doing something hard. I think the fact that he has this moral authority and this mandate means that he has to somehow find a way to push this hard stuff. The second thing is that, and I have to agree with Shashi here, there is follow-up. See, there are three ways in which Narendra Modi can change things, for example, about sanitation and cleanliness. The first is by using the fact that he is, as I said, the most popular leader in India's history, to make people feel concerned about the fact that they're throwing stuff out of windows. And I think that is extraordinary, and that he can, exactly, he has in fact changed how a lot of young people, in particular, school children, feel about this kind of thing. And I think that's wonderful. That's a very important first step. The second step, and this is where his history as a chief minister comes in, is that he can probably look at like good small ideas and say, this is a good project, this is the kind of thing that should be implemented. Now that works great if you're a municipal leader, it works passably if you're a chief minister. It becomes somewhat hard to do for everyone if you're a prime minister of a country with 1.2 billion people. Okay, so we have to recognize he had to stop giving us nice little ideas in his speeches and instead do point 3, which is enable other people to find those good ideas and implement them wherever they are.
Right.
So then you have to start talking about changing the laws for decentralization, giving local authorities real power, I should be able as a resident to say, okay, I want to clean up my neighborhood, I will be able to use this much of my house tax, have some kind of accountability and fix my neighborhood. And that is changing the law, and he should be able to do that.
Okay, next suggestion is to tweet him all of these as opposed to sending the books across. You have, okay, 1 second.
I was completely delighted when you mentioned Swatantra Party. Mr. Raj Gopalachari and Meenu Masani stood for limited governance and least amount of governmental intervention. At the same time, you associate yourself with the most socialistic Congress party in India. If given an option, would you want to go back to the Indian Libertarian? Would you want to go back to the Swatantra Party and talk about least government intervention and reforms?
Well, you see, the Congress party itself is a very big tent, young man. We have people who are self-proclaimed Marxists, like my friend Mani Shankar Iyer and others, and we have people who are free marketeers. I suppose Mr. Chidambaram, Mr. Montek Singh, Manmohan Singh would qualify. And so, because it's such a broad tent, I find that the post-liberalization Congress is hospitable territory for this kind of approach. The one area where I believe the Swatantra Party was insufficiently attentive was in realizing that the magic of the market cannot appeal to those who can't afford to enter the marketplace. We still have an awful lot of poor people in our country. That was the one area where, if you like, if I'd been in the Swatantra Party, I was too young, I would have been on the left of the Swatantra Party. And in the Congress, economically, I suppose I'm in the right of the Congress Party. But the bottom line is that I believe we must have economic growth, we must lift governmental regulations, we must free the creative energies of our people, particularly our young people. But from the enhanced government revenues that will come, we must ensure that we use it to benefit those who have nothing and who are not yet enabled or empowered to get something. We need to spend that money giving them the strength to be able to stand on their own feet, and then they'll also benefit from the liberalization we've given. I've seen this in my own family. I've seen this in the experience of people. Give them an opportunity but you've got to give that to them. In the old days, people left the farms to go to big cities in order to acquire the skills, the opportunities that they couldn't have in the farms. The increasing urbanization of India is one possibility. We've got the excellent idea of improving the facilities in our village areas as well. Imagine what you can do if we bring broadband seriously into every Indian village. And people don't have to go to a city to do business process outsourcing kind of jobs. They can sit in computers with broadband in their villages and do something other than a dead-end agricultural job. There's a lot more stuff that we can do, but it requires a whole lot of things. Mihir has summarized them so well. Change the laws, empower people, delegate, and at the same time have practical steps to help them to get from one place to the other.
Okay.
I believe the Congress Party is capable of ensuring that, but we have to earn our chance the next time around.
We're just about out of time. We have time for one more question, and then I know there's so many people who want. Okay, the girl in the white. Go ahead.
A very good afternoon to the panel. So when any one of you can answer this question. So when we're talking about the demographic dividend, I am a young woman who really wants to participate in the politics. But when I see the nature of debate taking in the parliament, the kind of language which the parliamentarians are using, any one of you can answer, what would encourage me as a youth to participate in the politics, in the organized politics, in direct or indirect ways when we see a majoritarian party coming up with the schemes, make in India, or you know, do whatever for the girls, but no implementation. So what inspires us to participate in the politics?
Firstly, does she need 30 more years to qualify before she becomes a youth leader?
But what should inspire you is a desire to change it and make it better. I've come into politics. There should be more and more people from the professional middle classes in our country who traditionally have believed, like my mother does, even today, that if you are smart enough to study hard and pass the exams, you go and do a real job. It's only those who fail the exams who go into politics. That's what she believes. The truth is it shouldn't be like that. You need to have people represent you in your democracy whom you can be proud of. And that means people like you should also take the trouble to get in. I'm in politics. I don't make the kinds of speeches you're concerned about. There are many others like that. The more people come into our politics from a different sensibility, an educated mind, an urgent concern for the broader future of our country and not just their own self-advancement, the better our politics will be. And as the electorate gets more educated and more middle class, I believe our politics will change for the better. I decided that I was going to take the plunge now, and perhaps in many ways the political world wasn't ready for the kind of approach that I represented. But it's getting readier. The political class itself is changing, our politics is changing, our electorate is changing. By the time you are as old as I am, I'm sure you will be in politics, as long as you don't give up hope, because hope is what makes this country great.
Okay, last few words over here because we do have to wrap the session. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you all for listening. I just wanted to say on the specific question of politics, all is not lost. And if you ever want to feel hopeful, all right, go on the website of Parliament and don't look at them shouting at each other. Don't watch on TV. Sometimes they just do it for the cameras. Go and look.
Sometimes.
Well, frequently they just do it for the cameras. Cameras are bad. All right. What you need to do is instead look at the questions that they're actually asking, the submitted questions. That's where they're actually doing their job as jobs as MPs. Some of those questions are much smarter and much more focused than the questions that any journalist has ever asked in the past 2 years. And the government is forced to reply to them because that too is their job.
Right.
Read those questions, read those answers, and I genuinely guarantee to you, you will feel a lot better about the people running the country, whichever party they're from.
This is so inspiring. I want to thank both Shashi Tharoor and Mihir Sharma for writing these fabulous books and communicating so well. Thank you. You can also tweet them the rest of your